Well, welcome to another episode of the Grazing Sheep Podcast. I'm your host, Big Tom Perkins, along with Dr. Cameron Meyerly. And today we got with us Dr. Andrew Weaver. And just wondering what we're talking about today there, Cameron.
Yeah, so we've had Dr. Weaver on here previously for an episode. And for the second season of the podcast, we were hoping to dive a little deeper into some more scientific topics. We've talked a lot about estimated breeding values and certainly wanted to get some opinions outside of just you and I, Tom. And so asked Dr. Weaver if we could do some kind of a short series and a quick series on EBVs, estimated breeding values, specific traits. And so today we're just going to have kind of an introductory what EBVs are, how we can use them, how they compare maybe to some other livestock species, and just the using them as a genetic tool, what our best approach is long term. So yeah, again, Andrew, thanks for being on here with us, and just your generalized opinion on EBVs and potential you see for the sheep industry and producers to utilize them.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on here, and always look forward to the discussions we have. So EBVs are a great tool that we can utilize in our selection programs. And you often hear, many of you may have heard me talk about them before or others, and why are they so unique? Why are they so valuable? And it really comes down to isolating that genetic component of a trait from the environmental component, because as we know, the phenotype that we observe in an individual. So whether it's a measurable trait like their weaning weight, or the number of lambs they have born, or their parasite resistance, or just their visual appeal. What we see, what we observe, that phenotype is a result of the genetics that individual has, in addition to the environment that they've been exposed to. So a portion of what we see is contributed by genetics, and a portion is contributed by environment. And actually, for most of our traits, the majority of that is contributed by the environment. And so we need to be able to isolate out the genetic component and be able to determine, what component of that trait was truly genetic, what component, what portion of that trait can actually be selected for, can be passed from generation to generation, versus what maybe is just an environmental or a management thing. Because remember, the environment's going to change. Even on our own farm, the environment's going to change year to year. And so if we're not careful, we may be selecting for an environment that's not going to stay constant. Rather, we really need to focus on the genetic component, because that genetic component can be passed on to the next generation. I can go to your farm and find a ram with those genetics that I'm looking for and bring them back to my farm, and the DNA is the same. And so being able to accurately identify, and quantify genetic merit can have a lot of value.
Yeah, so when you're talking environment, it's not necessarily just temperature, if it's raining or not, or if we have a heavy snow load in the wintertime for that specific location. It's more management system, correct?
Correct. It's all of those external things. So it's your nutrition program, your grazing system, whether they're housed in a barn, whether they're housed on pasture. All of those things contribute to that environment that we're exposing those animals to, that we're asking those animals to perform in. And our environments change greatly, not just in geographic region, but just in terms of our management system. Here in North Carolina, we've got grass-based producers raising Katahdin sheep and doing it relatively low inputs. We've also got folks raising Katahdins in older tired poultry houses where they're inside pretty much all year long, and being, the feed's being delivered to them on a daily basis. So again, same breed of sheep, but vastly different environments. And those sheep, maybe we can't compare those individuals fairly because they're just exposed to, such different management systems.
So in other livestock species, we've heard the term EPD, estimated progeny differences, and in sheep we have EBVs. Can you explain a little bit kind of the difference in there and why we use different verbiage to describe both of those things?
Yeah, so if any of you are familiar with cattle, you're probably familiar with the term EPD, expected progeny difference. And essentially that's showing the potential genetic merit of the offspring of an individual. So what are they going to pass on? An individual passes half of their genetic merit onto their offspring. So an EPD is going to give us some sense on offspring progeny performance, where an EBV, an estimated breeding value, indicates the genetic merit of that individual itself. So that's going to tell us that individual ewe or that individual ram, that is their genetic merit. And then if we wanted to calculate or predict what they would pass to their offspring, we simply divide the EBV by 2. So remember, half of genetic merit is passed to the offspring. So if you take an EBV, so if you say the EBV is 5 pounds, then the EPD would be 2.5 pounds because they're going to pass half that to that next generation. So it's just simply differences between the cattle industry and the sheep industry, and the way they've chosen to express those traits. They really, you can interpret them, you can utilize them in very similar ways, just slight differences in what they actually define.
So when we're thinking about potential, EBVs have been around for a little while now at this point. It was something that I wasn't necessarily exposed to growing up, with sheep. What do you think? Where do you think the value is for the commercial producer, and how do we get individuals to understand and know more about it, and then use them on their farm, and maybe how should they be using them on their farm?
Yeah, so EBVs can be a really powerful selection tool for not only the seed stock producer, but also for the commercial producer. And like I said, they indicate genetic merit. So that said, we can go out and make ram purchasing decisions, selection decisions, breeding decisions much more accurately using that tool versus just phenotype alone. And so if you're a seed stock producer, obviously it makes sense to use these breeding values. You're trying to raise genetically elite seed stock to pass on elite traits onto your commercial customers. But if you're a commercial producer, that's where I see a lot of value in these, and that you can buy in rams that have genetic merit, elite genetic merit for those traits that you see valuable in your commercial operation. And that could vary, operation to operation. And if we keep in mind that the idea that after just 4 generations, over 90% of the genetics in a flock will be the result of sire decisions. And so in the sheep business, 4 generations doesn't take that long. So if you're buying rams and retaining replacements in a relatively short time period, you can make substantial genetic progress simply by going out and buying rams with high quality genetics based on EBVs for the traits that you're interested in. So you can kind of think about it in the sense that if you go out and buy rams that are enrolled in an SIP that have estimated breeding values, if you do that for 4+ generations, over 90% of the genetics that you're observing that you have in your flock will be a representation of those NSIP genetics, those rams with those high quality EBVs that you went out and purchased and you utilized in your selection program. So in just 4 generations, you have over 90% of the genetics in your flock representing NSIP genetics, and you've never been enrolled in the program. You've simply gone out and identified seed stock producers with those elite genetics, purchased those rams, and utilized those in your flock. So they can have tremendous value from that standpoint.
That's exactly what we did here. That's exactly what we did here, Andrew. It was it's been amazing. We're enrolled in NSIP, and I thought it would be a much steeper hill to climb. But just bringing in those rams with the EBVs that we were looking for, it's amazing when I started to get my numbers back this year, and you start looking at how much parasite resistance has improved, how much the post-weaning weights have improved, the number of lambs born, number of lambs weaned, just paying attention to those and trying to bring rams in that would benefit in that way with those EBVs. It truly is amazing how quickly it seems to come on. I know in the cattle industry, people spend years and never get there.
Yeah, I think that's a real advantage with our small ruminants, and that turnover, that generation interval is so much shorter. In cattle, you're waiting 2 years before you ever get, a first calf, and then um, it just takes a while to prove those animals and to turn over those genetics. You get 2 years to get a calf, and then it's another 2 years before that calf has a calf. In the sheep business, that those genetics turn over a lot faster with a shorter generation interval, and so. You put these tools to use and really see a benefit in maybe a shorter time period than what you might in the cattle business.
Yep.
And I think that was the point we were trying to make there a couple episodes ago on ram selection. And what we're looking for is, it makes up a significant portion of those genetics long term. And I was curious here, Tom, while Andrew was talking, about finding out or learning about EBVs and utilizing them. As someone who is, a commercial producer, how did you find out about NSIP and EBVs? And I guess what advantage did you see in it and made you want to at least use sheep with EBVs and then take the step further and collect, those phenotypes, those performance data points, and enroll your flock in their Farm Belt, PA?
Yeah, I guess when I first bought my sheep, I bought registered Katahdins, and then they were transferred into my name as ownership, and then I got from KHSI I became a member of KHSI, the Katahdin Association, and they sent out this like welcome package, and then there was a book that or a magazine or whatever that talked about EBVs and a little bit, and just some of the things that you should be collecting data on. And as being, a first-time shepherd, I just kind of devoured all the information I could. And as we went along and kind of used some really subpar rams, right away I could see there was just this difference in these lambs. These lambs just weren't thriving. They just weren't doing well. And in talking to a few people, they said, you need to start looking at some of these NSIP sales and try to bring in some better rams with better EBVs. And I don't even remember where I learned about NSIP, but I started setting in on the NSIP monthly meeting calls through Zoom and so on, and just kind of just was the fly on the wall, just listening to people talk and trying to gather this information, trying to learn as much as I could about it. And when we bought our first NSIP ram, we already had a ram that we had bought from a show flock that had never been in NSIP, and started to collect that data, submit that data. And when we got that data back, there were two rams that we were using. One we named Tim, and the other we named Brad. And Brad had been in NSIP, and Tim was in a show flock. And immediately, when I got that data back, you could see a huge difference between that Tim ram and that Brad ram. And I was convinced at that point that was definitely the way to go. To stay in NSIP, keep collecting that data, keep bringing in rams that would help improve the EBVs that I was most interested in. It was night and day. It's shocking. I still have ewes that throw lambs that just do nothing as far as parasite resistance go, and don't have much for any kind of weight gains. And you go back and you look and you're like, yep, those are Tim daughters. Those are in the Tim line. And those sheep do fine in my environment, the way I graze and so on. I don't have, I'm not worming them all the time. Very seldom do I worm anything, but like I say, you can see it. It's night and day. The thing that Tim ram did do, just phenotypically, was I just wanted straighter legs in my sheep. That made a huge difference.
Yeah, and so do you think those sheep just collecting, normal production records, do you feel that you would be able to identify those sheep with your normal number born, number weaned, weaning weights that you should be taking in just a commercial production aspect? Do you think you'd be able to identify those what you're calling Tim sheep compared to the ewes out of the improved NSIP ram that you purchased?
I think you could, but I think it would take you years and years to be able to see it. I think you'd have to be somewhat of a mathematical wizard to sit down and be able to calculate that all out yourself. I think that's the biggest advantage for me with NSIP is I don't have to calculate this. I can collect that data, send it in, and I get a report back.
Yeah, somebody else is doing the calculation.
Yep.
And then
my
it's up
understanding
to you to decipher
Yeah,
the
my
numbers.
understanding it's supposed to be this computer in Australia that calculates all this.
Right. Yeah, and that's, for me, the real exposure to NSIP didn't come until grad school. And I'm of the opinion you shouldn't have to go to grad school to learn about EBVs.
No, I
And
didn't
so,
even high
a
school.
lot of right, and that's through extension. I know Dr. Weaver's, really pushing it down in North Carolina, and what's been cool to sit on the fence and watch is you've got producers down there that have truly bought in to the concept, to the idea, and have then taken and invested in those genetics, which is exciting because it's going to work and it's going to be dollars that are worth the investment. I know, like, coming from the clubland industry, there's a lot of sheep that people spend a lot of money on that they never produce what is intended, or what you would hope. Now, and that being said, there's a lot of rams that people spend a lot of money on, and they hit those goals and achieve what they thought they would, and maybe more so. But it's kind of a mixed bag that you're grabbing into. So I am curious, brought up kind of what you're doing in North Carolina there, Andrew, and when you're thinking about producer education and getting new people involved in NSIP in terms of even commercial producers buying those rams, which I think is underutilized, and we need more producers to do just that. Do you have any success stories or areas that you've seen producers kind of accelerate their genetics, their flock to improve performance, or has there not been enough time to really evaluate that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've only been down here for about 3 years, so maybe not a tremendous amount of time to see advancements, significant advancements in genetic progress as a result of that. But there has been a fair amount of interest, and I'm encouraged just that folks are interested and looking for rams with EBVs, and not even I don't want to promote our own flock or anything like that, but interest in just buying sheep out of the Eastern Alliance sale here a couple weeks ago and last summer, and other NSIP sheep and other sales around the country from other breeders in NSIP. It's been encouraging to me to see a number of North Carolina producers go out and reach out to Katahdin seed stock producers around the Southeast and purchase genetics that are backed by EBVs, that have genetic merit for those traits that they see valuable in their operations. And so we'll see as time goes on and we continue to quantify these traits and measure performance and what kind of improvements can be made. But I think there's certainly been an investment in NSIP genetics in this part of the country, which is something to be pretty excited about, I think. And I think too, just in terms of from a scientific standpoint, the validation work that's been underway, we know these EBVs work. From a mathematical standpoint, we know they work, but sometimes a bunch of statistics, it's hard to show folks on a piece of paper and say that, yep, because all of this math is the way that it is, these EBVs work. When you can actually, take a group of rams that are maybe extreme in different directions for a given trait, and breed them to a group of ewes and actually show people, how those lambs perform and that they do match what is predicted by their sire breeding values. I think that has a lot of merit and a lot of worth. A shout out to the Leading Edge project, which concluded a few years ago now. I commend all the individuals that were a part of that organized it and carried out that project and what's come of that. That did an excellent job of illustrating the power of breeding values, especially those for those traits such as growth and muscle, and the value that might have in Western range production systems. But we know that it's the same math calculating those EBVs as calculating our growth and muscle EBVs for Katahdins or any other breed. As a result of that project, we have some great data to show to illustrate the impact and the value that EBVs can have and validate their effectiveness in breeding programs from that standpoint. And then we've done some work at West Virginia a couple years ago, looking at the fecal egg count breeding value. And again, we saw, consistency in terms of sire EBVs and, being able to accurately predict, the trends in those progeny, whether it be, high fecal egg count or low fecal egg count. And so there's lots of data out there, and there's more coming, I think, on the sheep side of things. If we look into other species on the beef cattle side of things, that work's been done as well. And so if you have any doubt in terms of the validity of these breeding values, I encourage you to reach out to one of us. Maybe look up some of these studies that have been done. I'm happy to discuss in more detail with you. Give me a call, shoot me an email. These breeding values are, a valid selection tool. There's a lot of math that goes into their calculation, a lot of different components there that may not be the easiest to understand. But if you just trust in those statistical models and the value and the meaning of those EBVs and utilize them, we know that they're going to have, they're going to work, whether you're selecting for something in a positive direction or negative direction.
So, Dr. Weaver, I'm curious, we've talked a lot about what EBVs can do. Is there anything they can't do, or in your opinion, just some of their limitations?
Yes, that's a great question. And there's oftentimes concern, if I breed just for EBVs, am I going to end up with sheep that phenotypically aren't appealing, aren't visually an animal that I would like to look at? And I think you can find sheep that have those good breeding values that also are visually appealing. Just because you select for one doesn't mean that you lose the other. But at the same time, if we're not cognizant of those breeding values, pay attention to those and select for those, genetic traits, a genetic component of those traits, I should say, we're really not going to see genetic progress unless we do that. So we need to select for those EBVs and utilize those EBVs effectively. But at the same time, we can still monitor those phenotypic traits, those visual appeal type traits that we may put more or less focus on, and try to find sheep that are still eye appealing, but have good EBVs as well. It's really up to personal preference on the weight that you place on those different things. Some folks obviously are going to weight, visual appeal a little bit more than the EBVs. Others might put a lot of emphasis on EBVs with very little attention to visual appeal. And it really just depends, or some people might try to balance between the two. And that's really up for you as an individual producer to decide and take your flock in the direction that you want to take it. And we're going to talk on, and it sounds like in subsequent episodes, we're going to talk about some of the individual traits that are available with EBVs. But we also need to be cognizant that we don't have an EBV for every single trait out there. And so, traits like aseasonality, we don't have an EBV that tells us that ewe is going to breed out of season. We don't have an EBV that tells us about feet and leg structure. We don't have an EBV that tells us about mouth structure. We don't have an EBV for feed efficiency. So, feed costs are the largest component of our input costs every year. And yet we don't have an EBV that tells us which sheep convert better than others. And so there are still, traits out there that have economic relevance that we do not have an EBV for. So we may need to pay attention to some of those other things as well, in addition to utilizing EBVs for the traits that we do have available to us. So it's a bit of a balancing act. And really, we like to say, optimize, maybe rather than maximize. Find what's optimal for your operation and your breeding program, and utilize that. And that's going to vary some from operation to operation.
So in short, the stigma that surrounds some production oriented or NSIP specific sheep, that they're ugly, they don't have to be.
No, they don't have to be. I've seen a number of NSIP sheep that I could sit down and out in that pasture and look at all day long. There's some really nice looking sheep out there that have tremendous EBVs at the same time, and so I think it's possible. You're not necessarily going to do that in one generation. It might take several years of breeding and selection to identify and to produce those types of sheep. But I think it is possible.
So we can't just close our eyes and pick them out sitting at the kitchen table off a piece of paper.
No, I think we need to remember too that we can have that ram that's the top 1% for multiple traits. And if his feet and legs aren't right, if his mouth isn't right, if his scrotal development and semen quality isn't good, he's not going to breed a single ewe. And so while he may have elite genetic merit, he's never going to pass that on because he doesn't have the structural attributes that would allow him to be an effective breeder. So we need to keep those types of things in mind as well. Just because they have elite numbers doesn't mean we can ignore those sheep that have incorrect mouth structure, that can't get around well, or have incorrect scrotal development. Those types of production traits we need to be mindful of, in addition to finding those sheep that have those elite EBVs.
But this has been great, and I'm really looking forward to the next episodes we've got coming with individual traits and kind of what they are and how we can utilize them to improve production there in the flock and on the farm.
We are coming up on our time, Cam. We kind of miscalculated
I know
on our time. But so Andrew, we definitely thank you for being here. And we're going to get you on for some future podcasts and dive more into these EBVs. So we thank you for listening to the Grazing Sheep podcast. If you want to reach out to us, you can at bigtomperkins@gmail.com. There's a Facebook page. We'd love for you to get on there and hit that like button and the follow button, and you can drop some questions in there if you'd like to as well. So it's been good catching up with you guys.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Look forward to joining you next time, and it's always a great discussion.
All right, then we'll talk to you later.
Sounds good.
Bye.